Monster Hunter is a big deal. It always was in Japan, but with its newest iteration it's finally getting more recognition in the West, and that's huge for the future of the franchise. Monster Hunter has changed, and how Capcom perceives the success and failure of those changes will no doubt be informing future developments and iterations of the franchise. And while the consumer can vote with their dollar, they can also engage in internet argument, and we all know how well that goes. So yeah, we need to talk about casualization. Whether you feel the term applies to Monster Hunter World or not, the conversation around the subject tends to push backwards on both sides. The accusation of casualization is one that invalidates the enjoyment of new fans of the franchise, or even old ones who happen to like the changes. By claiming that World isn't a real Monster Hunter game, it spreads an elitist mentality, raising the question of what World has lost in the transition to the current console generation, but in a dismissive way without actually addressing it. And the pushback is no better, with World defenders claiming that the original games were archaic mediocrity, and that Monster Hunter is only now a good game, as if the originals became a cult favorite and one of the best-selling franchises in Japan on accident. Both sides of the argument have some merit to them. The old games had archaic design decisions that desperately needed an update, while World has changes that are certainly questionable. But in my hyperbolic example between representations of actual arguments I've seen, there's only dismissive claims and destructive attitudes. And if we want to compare new and old, I want to do it with a forward-thinking mindset. Like Tri's changes once set the standard for the franchise looking forward, through its revamped hitboxes if nothing else, World's mark on the franchise is not one that's going to go away. So expect the occasional constructive critique in hopes of finding ways to account for the changes while both satisfying as many fans as possible without losing what made the franchise so good in the first place. But in order to evaluate those changes beyond personal preference, we need some kind of standard. So firstly, I need to ask the question, what is casualization? Casualization is defined as the altering of work practices so that regular workers are employed on a casual and short-term basis. Well, that's unhelpful. So to find something more specific, let's take this article from ENA Global, which takes a look at casualization on an industry-wide discussion, defining the casual game as one meant to attract people to gaming, noting Nintendo's simplification of gameplay through the likes of Brain Age and Wii Sports as a form of casualization. Which is to say, simplification with the purpose of encouraging new fans to enter the medium or franchise. The idea of attracting new customers is obvious and expected from a business standpoint, but intent of changes can only be assumed without evidence such as interviews. And even then, what matters at the end of the day is how the changes affect the game, not the reason they were made for. The potential simplification is ultimately what needs to be addressed. So, what is simplification in regards to gameplay? What it isn't is streamlining. In older Monster Hunter games, carving was accomplished by pressing circle, so in order to carve multiple times you had to hit the button multiple times, but now you can hold the button to continuously carve. It's convenient, but such minor change should not be frowned upon. I also don't think simplification lies in accessibility. That's a more difficult topic, but when I refer to accessibility, I think of options that don't affect gameplay. Having resolution, screen size, and volume sliders, for instance, make the game more accessible on a technical level. By lowering settings, it allows players with less up-to-date hardware to play the game more easily. The existence of controllers for disabled players or settings for color blindness also increase availability. These aren't gameplay-focused matters, because I think it's fair to define simplification in regards to games as the removal or reduction of meaningful player choice or agency. Gameplay changes are inevitable from iteration to iteration, but a change doesn't have to simplify the game. But we do still need to talk about what a meaningful gameplay choice is, and where changes regarding streamlining and accessibility fall relative to simplification. Options like screen resolution or brightness settings don't affect gameplay, thus there's nothing to simplify. And difficulty settings like cheats or hard mode are an interesting conversation, but not a relevant one for Monster Hunter. Difficulty itself is very relative, as what I find easier or more difficult will not reflect on all players, especially with the variants of weapon types that give players an easier or more difficult time depending on the monster. Pink Rathian loses her spine with her tail cut, but you aren't doing that with a hammer. As for streamlining, what separates a streamlined alteration from a simplified one is in how that change alters choice. Being able to register armor sets or swap decorations without paying is streamlining, because in order to reach point B from point A, the only meaningful player input required is time, because the player cannot alter their actions in between those points to result in a more favorable outcome at the risk of a less favorable one. Putting on an armor set that you're familiar with piece by piece, decoration by decoration, is tedium, and there is no negative impact to the actual set of choices in gameplay by changing it, so its removal is not a form of simplification. But when it comes to slaying a monster, while point B, the monster being dead or captured, ultimately never changes, the path to that point is chock full of all kinds of interesting choices. Weapons, armor, items, gear, move memorization, combos, pattern recognition, environmental understanding. Mastery or impotence will decide whether point B is reached in good time, if at all. So, by defining casualization and simplification in regards to meaningful player choice and agency, we can start to move forward the discussion a little bit. There is a lot to go through, so let's start with a spot of gameplay that's been a sore spot to newcomers since the days of the PS2 and good old freedom. The classic potion flex is a saucy bit of character animation that's well in line with the juxtaposition of weighty animations and more naturally proportioned characters with their zany, expressive, and exaggerated body movements. But it does beg the question of why doesn't the hunter just drink the damn thing and move on with his life instead of taking another fireball to the face? The time spent healing is no accident. From hitting the button to the player regaining their character's movement, it takes 3.5 seconds, meaning at least as much time is needed to safely get off the potion. What this achieves is instilling the player with a sense of deliberation and foresight. Mashing the button mid-fight without thought or care is only going to end in suffering, so the only way to properly heal would be to time the potion used as to safely avoid damage, which requires monster knowledge, prediction, and a bit of luck. Or at least, a bit of not being unlucky. Now, World has made several alterations, but a key change regarding zones is absolutely crucial to understanding both the reasons for the change and the ramifications for it. This was specifically brought up in a pre-release interview, in which director Yuya Tokada mentions the addition of movement while drinking a potion, specifying that no longer is there a safe place to hide by popping out to relative safety. A more experienced player might scoff at the very notion of leaving the zone just to heal, but it is a choice offered by the original game design. And to get at the ramifications of that choice, let's break down the difference between hard and soft punishments, an idea I first became aware of in a critical analysis of Wario Land 4 by Daniel Johnson. Effectively, a hard punishment is one with tangible and objective losses, such as health or resources, whereas soft punishments are less tangible, such as loss of time. And it's in managing that risk of losing health and guarantee in losing time that separates a more experienced player from the novice. By leaving the zone to take a potion and bearing the brunt of the loading screen, the player incurs a higher soft punishment in the time taking, something a player who takes the higher risk by drinking in the zone would rather avoid. But there's a trade-off in safety. Leaving the zone guarantees that there won't be more damage taken in trying to heal, while a missed timing might lead to both further hard and soft punishments as the player must recover from their mistake, through both damage and the time needed to heal back up, if not the even more major hard and soft punishments found in carting when your hunter falls. Now, this idea can carry over into many games, but with World, the lack of zones means how long a monster might chase you has more random chance involved, thus the addition of the ability to drink while moving, which negates the potential soft punishments of bad RNG, if perhaps a bit too well. Potion drink length has increased, taking half a second longer for the confirmation visual and sound than the entire animation did in previous games, but the trade-off is that movement is now possible while drinking, though at the expense of stamina if running, and at a slower speed in all accounts. Adding to mobility is roll cancelling, which can stop a potion use before it started, or end one that's already been completed to save a few frames and get right back into the action. Roll cancelling is a great addition as it increases the options for choices and outcomes. Cancelling mid-drink expends the potion even if its full benefits aren't achieved, so while a timely roll might save the player some damage, poor timing might result in failure to get away or ending a potion drink unnecessarily. Novice players won't know the nuances, intermediate players may make mistakes trying to take advantage of them, and more advanced players will know exactly how to best manage the mechanics for optimal play. Roll cancelling is a great addition as it increases the options for choices and outcomes. Cancelling mid-drink expends the potion, even if its full benefits aren't achieved, so while a timely roll might save the player some damage, poor timing might result in a failure to get away or ending a potion drink unnecessarily. However, the walking movement itself doesn't offer quite as much, and for a simple reason. The time it takes to drink a potion while standing, while walking, and while running is completely identical. The only difference is that running takes up stamina. As a result, movement allows for more freedom to avoid monsters while healing, so while timing is still needed, the ability to move isn't offset enough. Because drink time is consistent, there is no reason to stand still unless the hunter is already in the perfect place. Even if low on stamina or hit with water or ice blight, which affects stamina recovery, The player should always be trying to get into a better position or get to relative safety. Since it's easier to find openings through added movement and roll cancelling, leading to no reason to stand still, there is less meaningful choice. The window for openings is wider, and the difference in time taken is so vastly offset by the lack of cost to movement that some nuance is ultimately no longer there. It's not irredeemable. With some tweaking, we can see how the system might be better served in the future. The most drastic change would be to remove movement and return to near instant healing like older games, but keep roll cancelling. This would make it work like whetstones. Using one in World locks the hunter to the ground, but a roll can cancel out of it, allowing a soft punishment of having to take more time to use the whetstone again in exchange for potentially avoiding the hard punishment. It would increase player choice without removing other options, as the player would still have to choose the proper time to heal, but would retain the added nuances of roll cancelling with the risks and rewards that come with them. However, that's an unlikely change, as removing drinking movement would likely be seen as a step back. So a change that would keep the added choice of movement while still requiring a lot more fine-tuning would be the added variance in drinking time. Generally speaking, faster movement would result in longer drink time, which would make the game of balancing hard and soft punishments a matter of small choices during the drink. Running could result in a drink taking 2 or even 3 times longer, while standing still would serve as the standard. It could even be visually represented by the hunter running off balance while attempting to drink, and a slightly staggered refilling of the bar. It already accelerates in the second half of the drink, so having it shake lightly while running would tip off the player that they should be keeping their movement down to drink faster. This gives the player a good reason to consider standing still, and reasons to consider moving based on the situation and their knowledge of the battle's pace, allowing for more choices and options without removing what's already there. Now, while I've said my piece on potions, health in general is affected by the expansion or addition of other systems. Specialized tools in particular offering players a whole set of equipment not available in prior games. Even just conceptually, the variety in itself offers an array of meaningful choice, and the recharge and usage time offers room for balancing. But for the purposes of discussion, we can divide them into 3 separate types and break them down one by one. The first up is the boosters, which allows hunters to place down fountains that offer benefits to the party as a whole. The affinity booster and cleanser just need to be in an accessible spot, as they don't need to be continually stood in to be useful. But the health booster restores health at a slow rate, layering health options with even more choice. A player could incur more soft punishment by standing in place doing nothing while the monster is off elsewhere, use a potion to heal up even faster, use a whetstone to manage time wisely, or otherwise try and be useful. Adding the monster into the equation makes the choices more interesting, as the player can now balance staying out of harm's way with staying in the healing fountain. Given the time limit and recharge rate, all tools could stand to be timed well, as failure to use them properly means wasted time while the monster runs away, making the tool less effective for the time being as a chunk of time is wasted on running after the monster. And like choosing between the more support-oriented hunting horn or the powerful greatsword, picking between the health booster and affinity booster is a matter of team makeup and relative skill. The stronger team can make shorter hunts out of the affinity booster, while having 4 health boosters isn't going to offer significantly greater benefits than just 1 or 2 would, but may be made up for in the amount of carting that's prevented. Secondly, we have the defensive mantles: Vitality, Temporal, Evasion, Rock Steady, Immunity, and the 5 elemental mantles. The latter few serve as situational defensive options, excellent against very specific monsters, like resisting Lunastra's Supernova or Kulvitaroth's Breath with the Fireproof Mantle, but that specificity is at the cost of more general use gear, and while you can change equipment mid-quest, it's not an efficient use of time. The 4 more general mantles are a bit interesting to discuss, as they are all rather strong, but offer different strengths to different types of players. The Temporal Mantle offers near immunity for a time, but at the cost of a higher recharge rate and interrupting combos, like for the Longsword Final Slash or Hunting Horn recitals. And it's unnecessary for higher skilled players who wouldn't be getting hit so much in the first place, and would be better served with more offensive options like the Evasion Mantle or Affinity Booster. The Rock Steady Mantle reduces damage taken along with negating knockback and getting stunned by roars or quakes, but it's also a silent killer. Character knockback is a major damage indicator and offers a huge amount of invincibility frames, so while the Rock Steady Mantle does reduce damage taken, against monsters who love their combos like Nergigante, it can be just as much of a detriment if not handled correctly. The Evasion Mantle gives more invincibility frames with your roll, and an attack boost for a successful dodge, but while the window is wider, it's still a higher risk than the virtual guarantee of the other 3 mantles, with higher gains in exchange for stricter requirements. The Vitality Mantle is the earliest option, but it's actually the weakest in the long term, as late game it will only resist a hit or two at best. But while not losing health when getting hit will always be of benefit to skills like peak performance, it doesn't offer the benefits of the other three. All of them offer different strokes for different folks, benefiting stronger players, but not without risks for improper use. And what I think justifies the existence of mantles is the last grouping of tools, the specialty mantles, such as the Glider, Impact, or Bandit Mantle. While they offer unique abilities, those abilities are specific, and work strongest in conjunction with equally specific armor or weapon setups over the general use, defensive, and support options. Due to their situational uses, they can serve as jumping off points for fun, specific armor sets. Tools are another layer of mechanics, and their versatility allows for further player expression and customizability, making them just as loaded with meaningful choice as armor or weapons. There will be ones more optimal for certain players or situations, but the series has so many that player knowledge will be tested time and time again. And on the note of player knowledge, we switch gears to perhaps the largest expansion of mechanics in Monster Hunter World, the environmental system. From health-restoring Vita Lilies and Vigor Flies to the ailment-inducing Toads, Poison Cups, or Flash Flies, these environmental traps and buffs aren't completely new, but are rather more generally applicable expansions on the previous, more context-sensitive environmental interactions of monsters like Diablos, Tigrex, or Elatrion getting stuck on the wall from charging. These new and more varied elements, however, have their trade-offs in use and complexity. Diablos getting his horns stuck naturally came to an end the moment his horns finally broke off, while using, say, the trees in the ancient forest or falling boulders are often one-time use, though there will be multiple available depending on the map. Alongside status effects like paralysis or pitfall and shock traps, they achieve roughly the same effect in leaving the monster vulnerable to player attack. Traps require inventory space, while statuses need certain weapons or uncommon gear like throwing knives. But environmental traps, as they are locked into place rather than being free to go wherever, are less tied to player agency, instead requiring opportunity, stricter timing, and environmental awareness, which gives the maps more variety in how they are interacted with. If you're low on Screamer Pods, you can just hit one of the Noyos with your Slinger to get a similar effect. But the best environmental traps don't just reward situational awareness, but punish the lack thereof. It happens. So with that in mind, the healing offered by Vigor Flies and Vita Lilies certainly seems like a low risk with high reward. You'll maybe need a bit of time to find one, but the reward of healing mid-combat might be worth it, while failure only expends the healing unnecessarily, as monsters don't restore health from them as the player does. But where it's deceptive is in that when you will most need to seek out a Vigor Fly is when you're at low health. If you happen to end up by one when needed, you'll be in luck, but that's statistically unlikely. The Ancient Forest has 4 zones with environmental healing, but the other 4 maps have only 1 each. And in zones the monster is likely to sleep in, there are never any to be found, meaning the last part of the hunt will be the most testing. But the risk in using them doesn't come from availability, but rather it's an opting to use one over another choice. A potion or healing fountain is a guaranteed way to heal in total player control, but consumes resources, while Vigor Flies and Vita Lilies don't consume player resources, but they aren't as reliable or convenient. Every step you take towards a Vigor Fly without taking a potion is another step that a monster can ruin your day. And again, it's player skill that will result in the best judge of circumstances between using a potion or relying on the environment, allowing for more emergent gameplay and happenings. And those deeper interactive ties with the environment give each map its distinctive feel, risks, and bounties purely through game mechanics. Beyond aesthetics and monster choice, the Ancient Forest is more welcoming through its healing Vigor Flies and Vita Lilies than the Rotten Vale is with its effluvial haze and pools of acid. And on the note of environment, one of the strongest consolidations World has made in regards to previous mechanics is the simple and elegant Slinger. Combining items from previous installments like throwing knives, stones, and flash bombs, it elegantly acts as a balancing factor while making the items more widely usable. In previous games, flash bombs could be thrown easily as long as you were ready, but in tying it to the Slinger, it takes a bit more time to switch back and forth between options, as you can only hold one type of item in the Slinger at one time. A hunter's Slinger will have a lot of use, between flash pods, knives, pods dropped by monsters that often guarantee flinches, or those with more specific effects, like Water Moss, which can get mud off of Gyrototis or Baroth, or even douse Anjanath's flame before he gets a chance to use it. Rather than merely having the item in your inventory and knowing when to use it, The player needs to balance environmental knowledge and monster needs to ensure they have the best Slinger loadout at any given time, adding a whole new layer of meaningful decisions that expand on what was, in previous games, using the right item at the right time rather than needing to think too far ahead beyond inventory. Now, moving on to another change that's very rested in the maps, but certainly may interfere with forethought and thinking, you have the light in the eye of the hunter, scout flies. All too helpful for picking out items and objects in the environment, they also serve as a guide to fighting monsters, though not immediately. From the start of the game, the player has to collect tracks themselves to get the scout flies to help. But after the hunter and scout flies become more experienced, they become more able to hone in on the monster from the start of the quest. In a way, this is automatically doing what the player might slowly pick up on in older games through memorizing monster patterns, but that's not completely gone either. The scout flies are automated and thus lacking in foresight. Your scout flies will try to walk you there, and the unfamiliar player might be tempted to follow them, as when the monster runs off they usually don't go too far. But when fighting Kushala on the ground in Zone 1, if he gets away then it'll be a much longer trip to the top of the forest by foot than it would be to fast travel by Wingdrake. So while the scout flies nudge the player towards their choices, the player isn't totally beholden to them, though such circumstances are rare. Paintballs, however, have an interesting quirk in comparison through their lack of permanence. They only last for about 5 minutes before they need to be reapplied, and it's not unknown for one to wear off right as the monster decides to fly away. Players familiar with the maps and patterns will be able to predict where it goes through foreknowledge or smart use of the lock-on in later games, but when taken in regards to choice, the player really has none. They can either use the paintball and occasionally reapply when it wears off, or if they think it's about to, or they can opt not to and go off of instinct and game knowledge. As it's entirely possible to go without it at no real cost to the player, and as their use only avoids soft punishment of time taken to find the monster, it's used as more of a learning device to become familiar with the monster's movement patterns. Using a paintball is less about giving the player an advantage than it is about how much the player is willing or able to learn, and failure to use them properly will result in lost time should the hunter faint or the monster escape unpainted. But in comparison, scout flies offer less options as they cannot be turned off, and to avoid them entirely is a hapless struggle against fate. That results in a lack of productivity out of spite. But that said, due to the added complexity of maps and the lack of divided zones, scout flies are something of a necessity. The maps are too large and intricate to be displayed on the larger screen of console games, requiring the zoomed-in view to be of any use, and paintballs are only effective because the whole map is available to the view of the player. But to shrink the maps back down would reduce the sense of scale and ultimately dial back some of the progress that World has made. To use the paintball system in World would result in endless frustration of having to open the map again and again, or being unable to see one's relative place on the zoomed out map taking up such a huge amount of screen space. Paintballs would also inevitably be Slinger pods, meaning that in order to be properly balanced, they'd need the extra time to reach and used, giving the monster extra time to run, though this would be offset by the ability to properly aim and catch them as they were going up or running off. And considering the very welcome change of zones to a single, interconnected map, the lack of meaningful choice offered by scout flies compared to the learning mechanism of paintballs might ultimately be necessary. Zones were established out of technical limitations at the time, and even today have reason to persist in handheld installments. And while there are yet to be any handheld games developed after World, for the foreseeable future it would be the only feasible way to continue Monster Hunter on handheld consoles until technology improves. But that doesn't negate them being frustrating between monsters dying out of zone, or flailing into areas the player can't reach but they can. The best advantage of zones is that by allowing the hunter to skip over large areas of the map, the area could maintain a sense of scale, like climbing the snowy mountains. But World achieves a similar effect without loading screen teleportations. Both systems, paintballs and scout flies, work perfectly for their respective map systems, though that doesn't mean some changes wouldn't be acceptable. Scout flies need to be readable, but they don't have to be so visually intrusive. Now, to finish off on that note of readability, there's one last interesting bit of game design I'd like to cover here: armor skills. The intricacies of armor skills have always been a bit obtuse when it comes to new players. Raise your hand if you've ever seen a newbie with 5 pieces of armor from 5 different sets, no active skills, and somehow has -13 fire defense and you're up against a high-ranked Teostra. While the old system was rather easy to understand once you knew how activation threshold of points worked, there was a vast amount of potential possible with the slight number differences. 2 identical sets of skills could be achieved with completely different sets of armor, and common sets would garner some level of fame for their effectiveness, like Senator SUUSS, which offered the absolutely vital Sharpness +1 early into Freedom Unite's high rank, or Booja Booja Boo, which gave attack up large and low rank of generations from some of the easiest monsters you could fight. World doesn't offer the same level of specificity though. As the point system has been dropped for flat levels, every piece offers something. Without the nuance of variable skill point numbers or the threat of negative skills, while every combination is on some level valid, every combination is also, well, valid. A meaningful choice is given that meaning by outcome, so if there's no negative outcome like the failure to activate a skill properly, or even outright negative skills, then the impact of the choice is lessened. It's undeniably a simplified system, in a way that makes it easier to get good skills without any kind of trade-off to hold it back, beyond lack of efficiency, as randomized decorations are only replacing randomized charms. The system change itself is understandable. To get a highly effective armor set required either a large amount of work or research outside the game, often through third-party software, tools, or other assistance. Compare this to other common outside help of past games, weapon trees and monster damage and reward charts, which were both diegetically incorporated into World, cutting out the middleman and leveling the playing field between those who don't utilize the outside help and those who do. In theory, the changes to armor sets accomplish the same thing in leveling the playing field, as an effective armor set can be found that much easier, but it's at the cost of complexity in service to appealing to newer fans at the expense of one of the game's most unique features. Incorporating the armor set finder into the actual game obviously wouldn't work, as the game would be making the choices for you, whereas monster information and weapon trees only nudge the player in the right direction. A compromise might be to restore the old system, but tutorialize it better so that it's less oppressive to new players. And while an armor set finder might be a bit much, an armor set builder would go along the visual preview that was added in World and could reduce some of the clunky legwork in trying to make a set, by allowing players to build a potential set without making the pieces outright until they choose to. Without the automation of third-party devices, it would mean more time spent in menus, but that time would be spent making actual choices, picking armor to avoid negative or inactive skills, with the end result being a blueprint to go out and hunt for. The third-party software would remain as a faster option for those in the know, but those without it won't be helpless either, because streamlining the data gathering and skill alignment process doesn't need to mean the mechanics are simplified too, but that's the system World has offered, and that's the system it might have for the rest of the franchise. Monster Hunter has undeniably changed, but while I argue for the strengths of many of those changes, there's been some undeniable simplification at work. But while simplification is not something that should be accepted without scrutiny, all too often have longtime fans thrown out the baby with the bathwater and dismissing any addition or change with potential negative ramifications. New mechanics don't have to come in at the expense of old ones. Scrutiny is fine, but a video game is a series of choices. If there are a variety of interesting choices for a variety of interesting situations, then it's a good system. World has room for improvement, but no Monster Hunter game has been perfect, and even with the changes, many of which have offered more rather than less, the core gameplay is still very much there, even if this is the first entry in a major shift from the 15-year-old norm. And with Generations Ultimate coming out, it's not impossible that the traditional style will remain, if only on handhelds for the time being. Even if it ultimately doesn't last, World's success will hopefully mean further iterations expand on the means and movements of man and monster alike. I didn't talk about everything, as there's a lot to dissect, but I hit some of the most commonly disparaged gameplay changes, and hopefully noted a standard that might help you to judge the changes between installments on your own. If there's anything I missed or was wrong on, an addendum might be in order. In the meantime, I don't usually discuss video games, but consider supporting me with Ko-fi or through Patreon, along with MathWiz, Volkion, Mohammed Hakim, Tengoon, Luis Segura, Janaeus Stewart, Oliver Mort, Gloogle, and the Sewer Boy. Thank you for watching.